Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. Mars makes it as easy as possible for you to get your pharmaceutical, medtech, or digital health product to the market and, of course, get the price it deserves. My name is Stefan Walzer. I'm the founder of Mars and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics already since 2004. And now let's learn about the market access and reimbursement systems around the globe. So the famous AMNOG, a very relevant kind of topic. I think it's one of the core processes across health technology assessment or drug assessments in Europe. So let us quickly describe how this really looks like. So first of all, companies can, it's not a must, so it's not mandatory, consult the GBA early on, either in order to get their input into the clinical development program, so especially obviously the kind of core components and questions like the comparator and or generally the study design, and clearly also the endpoint as one would probably know if you're an expert into the AMNOG, the endpoints of relevance for the GBA needs to be patient relevant. So that's also the place where you can, let's call it, discuss or share ideas on patient relevances for the endpoints. This is the very first step. It's not a must, so you can do that early on in order to get input into the clinical trial program, or you could do that as well shortly before a submission. Let's rather say what we normally recommend is do that maybe 9 to 12 months before a submission, but potentially when you have already your results available of your clinical trial or trials. Just keep in mind, the GBA is not discussing clinical trial results in the consultation. It's just about general questions like the definitions and the points I have just raised some seconds ago. So keep that maybe a bit aside. I think the key, real and core process then starts when the company is launching the product in Germany, which means there needs to be an EMA approval, and then the company needs to place a product in Germany. That is at the time when the price is being published through the IFA in the Lauertaxe in Germany. At that day, which is only happening twice a month, so either at the 1st or the 15th of a month, the product would be available. And at that time, the dossier needs to be the latest at the GBA. Keep in mind, the dossier is a quite complex kind of document, clearly, and it is clearly advised as well to go through the completeness check with the GBA, which need to happen 3 weeks before the actual submission. It is something to plan for, and I think it's really, really helpful, I think, for all of the submissions. So what is happening when the dossier is with the GBA? The GBA is taking the dossier and first of all, obviously doing again the kind of completeness check is then, if it's a non-orphan drug, is further sending that to the IQWiG, which is the kind of, let's call it watchdog in a way for Germany. So they are the HTA institution, which are then going through the whole dossier and reviewing it in depth. So they are especially looking at the systematic literature and the quality of the evidence, on the evidence in general, on the patient relevance of the endpoints, etc., etc. And they have 3 months' time for that. So from the time of the submission, you can basically calculate 3 months further, and that is then the time where the IQWiG is sending their evaluation to the GBA. They're not recommending the added benefit, or they're not recommending the kind of discussion on reimbursement or anything. They're just giving an advice how they would evaluate the submitted dossier and the underlying evidence. If it is an orphan drug, the IQWiG is only evaluating the number of patients, the epidemiology, and also the cost component of the dossier. The clinical side is then being evaluated by the GBA, but generally in a quite similar rigorous way as IQWiG. The important consideration here is just keep in mind, with orphan drugs, there's automatically an added benefit, so positive added benefit being granted. So it's more the question about the level and the probability of the added benefit. So what is then happening? Independent if it's an orphan drug or a non-orphan drug, 3 months after the submission of the dossier, so the availability of the product in Germany, there is a preliminary added benefit being published at the GBA's website. This is then also being communicated to the company. And then the company has basically 3 weeks' time to submit a written statement to the GBA. Important here also, it's not only the company who has submitted the dossier, but also any other scientific community or related company, for example, competitors, who could then also submit a written statement. Why is that important? Only institutions or persons related to the disease, obviously, who are submitting a written statement are allowed to come and register to the oral hearing, which is then happening shortly after, roughly a week after the submission of the written statements. Within the oral hearing, the GBA is asking their open questions. It is a kind of question answer, but clearly just one way. So the GBA is clearly coming up with the questions. It is a kind of sometimes even stressful situation, obviously, and the company can then answer those kind of questions. 4 persons from the company can come to the meeting, and you have the full board of the GBA sitting in front of you. Normally, the oral hearings lasting for an hour. After that, the company is, without any kind of answers from the GBA side and the decision at that time, right, is basically leaving the room, and the GBA is then taking some further time in order to assess and finalize that decision on the added benefit. The overall added benefit process with the GBA lasts for overall 6 months. So at the time of submission plus 6 months, that is exactly the time when the company receives the added benefit decision by the GBA. With the added benefit decision, the head association of the Statutory Health Insurance Funds, the GKV-SV, is also sending already an invitation to the company for the price negotiation in case there's a positive added benefit, because then companies are allowed to negotiate a higher price in comparison to the comparator. That is exactly quite clear, and there are 4 meetings happening after that 6-month time period until the company needs to agree on a price together with the GKV-SV, with the head association. Those meetings can not be shifted, so it's a must attend. The only thing what you could basically do if really one appointment does really not fit into the calendar is that the company can decline the meeting and just suggest a 5th meeting to be added, which is normally not really appreciated by the head association. Within the price negotiations, and just keep in mind, we'll have a separate podcast just on the negotiation part in Germany. There are different aspects which are taken into account. It's reference pricing across different European countries. It is also the number of patients, the number of expected patients. A lot of us were contracting parts which are important, like practice exemptions, Praxisbesonderheiten for all of the German speakers, and a couple of further things. I would just relate that to the next podcast when we discuss about the negotiation. So just keep that in mind. After 6-month added benefit evaluation, 6 months of a negotiation, overall 12 months, the AMNOG process being finalized. Basically, within those 12 months, there's free pricing. So the statutory health insurance funds need to pay the price a company is charging for, independent how low or how high it is. And after those 12 months, the new price might kick in. What if companies do not agree to a price? Then there's the arbitration board, which is happening for another maximum of 3 months. Just keep in mind, for those additional 3 months, the free pricing is just further going on. But if there's an agreement or not, the company has to pay back the difference for those 3 additional months to the statutory health insurance funds in Germany. So this is, in a nutshell, the AMNOG process. So core question relays, I have just said the AMNOG process is now basically in place for 10 years. So I think it's a good time point to evaluate what went well. And I think also to discuss a bit about the different learnings in the AMNOG process. So we have as well invited different guests. We have just introduced those as well. And I think it will be really important to also see what were maybe the big successes of the AMNOG process. And I think quite clearly, I'm very much interested also to see where there might be potential improvement needs within the AMNOG process. Okay, good. Let's just start. Okay. Thank you, Mathias, for joining that discussion. So first question around the AMNOG is just generally, could you just briefly explain also potentially with an example what the key differences for you are between the pre and the post AMNOG time?
Yes, happy to do it. We have now AMNOG evidence for about 10 years in Germany, and I worked in my payer function also before this time for many years. And it was always very difficult to bridge between physicians with a demand to prescribe new drugs and the sick fund side, who is by nature often a bit critical about new innovative drugs, especially with high prices. And that was a difficult sandwich position for us as a physicians association. Since AMNOG, we have very early structured analysis of the data of the potential clinical additional benefit of a product. And that makes it much easier on both sides to discuss with the physicians, also critical aspects in comparison to the pharmaceutical industry communications, but also to the sick fund side, because we have the structured evidence analysis, which we can use as an argumentation. So therefore, I think AMNOG was for us a big step forward from this perspective.
Okay, very good, brief kind of introduction. Would you also share the kind of, let's say, statement that the AMNOG was really saving billions of euros for the system?
I'm not sure if it really saved so much at the end of the day. I think there are different calculations out there from people who are better in calculating than myself. But what I think definitively happened is that we have a different allocation of spending, that we have much less spending for the so-called Me Too product and more focus on spending on real therapeutic improvement. If this is overall a saving, I'm doubtful. Mm-hmm. If I look at the overall expenditures over the year during the years, I think we can say that we see a quite constant increase on the spending for pharmaceuticals in Germany. On average, I would say something between 3 and 4%. And at least the AMNOG avoided that we move to an exponential increase. But at least what we can say is that we have a constant increase in the drug spending. And I think that we have a more focused spending of additional money. That would be my summary.
Okay, very good. So moving maybe a bit, I think it's just maybe a step further, right? At the end of the day, I was just asking whether maybe the monetary kind of savings were a big success. I think you explained quite nicely, how this could and should be maybe interpreted. But in general, what is the biggest success for you with the AMNOG really has shown for the system, but also here maybe from the different aspects, right? Maybe from you, from a physician association, but also from a health insurance and a patient perspective.
I think real therapeutic improvements have a much smoother start into the market than before. Because if a drug has really shown a substantial improvement, maybe the biggest or best example is the funding of the hepatitis C drugs. If you compare this to many other European countries where you had a lot of discussions about the value and how to pay for it, which patients are eligible, where we could really manage both a very good access for the patients, safe prescription for the physicians from an economic perspective, that they didn't have to be afraid of some economic punishment or whatever. And from a third perspective, at the end of the day, due to the upcoming competition, even I would say working price control. And I think this would have been much more difficult in the times before AMNOG.
Okay, you just raised the point of price control. What do you think about the free pricing for the first 12 months? Is that something which is rather giving a good incentive overall to, let's say, also smoothly from an industry perspective, maybe launch a product? Or is this more a kind of already way to, let's say, really press a bit the kind of monetary impact basically out of every drug before you even go into a price negotiation, where maybe, I think that's at least the idea, right? To have a fair price after the negotiation.
That sometimes gives a hint that it may be an unfair price at the beginning. My experience is that there are definitely a few cases where we may think, oh, this is overpriced. But on the other hand, I think this is often more psychological than a real problem, because we all know costs are price times volume. And to my experience, on average, the physicians in Germany are still cost sensitive, especially with new products. And if you have very expensive products who do not show a positive benefit rating, we usually do not see very much prescription of them. The physicians have quite early first indications from the IQWiG assessment, and they are cautious then. So I do not really see that this is a very big problem. It's something, of course, you can argue that it's more consistent to have the negotiated price retrospectively applied from day one. But on the other hand, my experience is that if you end up with no additional benefit, you do not have so many prescriptions as a relevant price premium. While if a drug really shows a considerable additional benefit, usually there's not so much of a price discount. So I think it's a question which is very much discussed, but I think which is not the main problem, to my understanding.
Okay, and I mean, because you just raised the kind of main problem, what is the main problem from your perspective?
I personally think that if we talk about problems, it's a question how to reevaluate prices and to really look after 2-3 years, also with some scrutiny, if a drug really delivers what was expected. And then also maybe to really think about, do we pay too much, or do we have to lower the price? If not real negative information is coming out, it's possible to maintain your price for a quite long time. And this is something where I think there may be room for improvement, to look more closely after 2 or 4 years, or 3-4 years maybe, if the promises really come true. And that's, I think, more a weakness overall, because these are much longer periods where a price is paid compared to the first 12 months where you always have a ramp up of the prescription.
So you are maybe more thinking as well towards, for example, what is happening in Switzerland, right? Where you have kind of regular, let's say, price checks every 2 to 4 years, depending a bit on the indication and the product itself, and also on the negotiation. But this is more what is maybe happening also maybe in the Netherlands. I think that's also applied there. Is that as well something where you're looking more towards, because then you see the real impact as well?
Yes, I think, we have changes in the pricing if comparators become cheaper, like availability of biosimilars. We see also changes if new evidence emerges, which improves the benefit rating. But we do not really see something to say, okay, we have a good trial database at the beginning, at launch. But is this indication of an overall survival benefit, whatever, is it really materializing in real life? And are we then really happy to, or not happy, but to consider to even lower a price if it's not delivered the initial promise? I know that this is it's difficult, and my feeling is that both sides do not really touch this area until now.
Okay. do you think maybe it's also still a bit of the issue of, let's say, the kind of different databases between, for example, the different health insurance funds? As obviously we don't know, let's say, which patients are, first of all, during the negotiation, really then be insured. And then it's obviously as well a bit of the question to bring all of the data together for consistent analysis, especially maybe with sample sizes which might not be that huge in terms of incidence prevalence in a given disease.
I think it would be at least a relevant step forward if we could at least track the patient population down to the subpopulations. I mean, we have this exercise of which makes a lot of sense when analyzing the clinical data, of course, definition of subgroups, looking for stratifying factors and so on. But then this very often vanishes in the real life data and follow-up because we are even not able to track those subgroups in a consistent way. And I think that would be one of the first sensible steps to have a more solid database, and then could think in a direction, as I just mentioned to you, because otherwise it's a great scientific exercise done during the benefit assessment. But if, for example, the subgroups cannot be continuously tracked, it's very difficult to see if the benefit assessment really materializes, both in a positive or negative way in real life.
Interesting. Okay, I mean, you brought in already a couple of different things, like what really I think is going well. I think you also include already some kind of ideas what might potentially be a kind of step forward in the future. But what are your best practice and worst practice examples maybe as well with respect to the AMNOG cases in the last years?
I think best practice is, for example, the whole diabetes area, where we heard for many years from the pharmaceutical industry, it's impossible to have outcome data available quite early, and how difficult everything is and impossible. And if we see the development, if we see the data we have for the group of the DPP4 inhibitors compared to the SGLT2, for example, where we have quite early additional evidence, which, for example, was empagliflozin, then led to an increase of the benefit rating. So I think this is positive. I know that this was not only AMNOG driven, but also by the safety requirements of regulatory bodies. But at the end of the day, it helped. Or, for example, another positive story are some of the therapies, for example, for atopic dermatitis, where we have more, let's say, last line options for patients requiring a systemic therapy, where we do not see so many prescriptions in an absolute number, but where we get the feedback from our physicians that it is good to have those as a last line options and can be prescribed without being afraid. I think this is something really good. I think we do not have really bad examples in terms of the AMNOG assessment, but I think what is a problem, which we still have, which is getting less now, but the issue that we did not work on the assessment of pre-AMNOG drugs. If we have huge areas like the NOACs, for example, where we have 2 pre-AMNOG and 2 AMNOG products, and only because of the free pricing of the 2 pre-AMNOG products, we pay hundreds of millions of euros. We think we could pay all the COVID vaccination out of this price delta if we compare this. And I think it's clear that you may not reassess every pre-AMNOG drug with a remaining patent lifetime of 1 or 2 years, but there are some big blockbusters where I think more consistency would have helped.
Okay, thank you. I think that was quite clear. You have also mentioned a bit the kind of, let's say, evidence and the evidence development and everything on that. I think just with the different other discussion beforehand, but also now with the practice examples. Can you again explain maybe a bit how also a company, maybe the industry, could also come up with let's say, the appropriate comparator therapy, also in advance, obviously, because we all know studies are being designed sometimes even years before an actual submission, but also with respect to endpoints where it might maybe a bit more easy, as we have now good examples, good experiences also with the GBA, that we can also expect, I think, what might be a patient-relevant endpoint, what might not be potentially accepted.
At the end of the day, it's amazingly simple, I would say, which often surprises companies. The framework of the patient-relevant endpoints is clear: mortality, morbidity, side effects, improvement of quality of life, and such an improvement versus standard of care. And at the end, it's as simple as it is. I think it's really important to understand that Germany focuses on the clinical improvement. We see examples where positive benefit ratings and attractive prices were achieved by quality of life data, by symptomatic improvements. So I think really focusing on this core points is and was, and I believe will be, the key to success. And if you think about additional endpoints, always think about the patient relevance of those endpoints. And again, patient relevance is clinical relevance. If you show clinical relevance, there's also a relevant willingness to pay. If you start with complex economic or whatever data, you are unlikely to succeed.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Could you maybe also make that even a bit more detailed? I mean, could you, for example, explain, you just brought up diabetes as an example beforehand, what might be a patient-relevant endpoint there? Is HbA1c a relevant endpoint? Because some people just claim that this is a clinically relevant endpoint.
No, it's not accepted as a patient-relevant endpoint by the GBA. And I think it's also clear that it won't be the case in the future, because it's the endpoint and the reflection of standard of care. And if we see that the guidelines develop more and more to a patient-individualized HbA1c target, then it's unlikely that maximization of the achieved delta in the HbA1c is not seen as a relevant endpoint by the GBA, because they want to see, with the optimized treatment approach, to see the optimized outcome in terms of, it's clear, either the direct blood glucose associated endpoints like hypoglycemia, or what is, at the end of the day, what is the main goal of the treatment of a diabetes patient? It's the long-term control of the disease and avoidance of the complications of diabetes. If you look, this is not only a benefit assessment thing. If you look, for example, in the disease management programs, everywhere it said, do it patient-specific, individualize it, and try to guarantee the best possible outcomes for the patients in terms of the long-term complication of diabetes. And this is what is reflected. And I think it's, the lessons learned are quite clear. And I would seriously consider, there are so many success examples and so many examples of endpoint which haven't been accepted in the last 10 years. And then if something couldn't prove its patient relevance over the last 8 or 10 years, then I would always carefully consider the likelihood to change this with the data I bring for a new product when I submit a dossier to the Federal Joint Committee.
Okay, perfect. That makes a lot of sense. I think that was also a very good example, I think, which can also be transferred to other disease areas. Okay, maybe moving to the last bit of the discussion. Where do you see potential improvement needs also within the AMNOG process, besides maybe what you have mentioned early on in terms of the pricing and also maybe the kind of pre-assessment after 2 to 4 years' time?
I think we have to think about the orphan space a bit. I think it is also in the future necessary to give some support for orphan drugs, especially if really new therapeutic areas are discovered. On the other hand, if we talk about areas like PAH, for example, then the question is really, why do I need so much more protection in such areas? So I think there shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach for the orphan drugs, but really a reflection if in an orphan indication there is already an established standard of care or not. And if it is there, then I think it's a sensible recommendation to ask there for head-to-head data also, while in other areas, orphan areas, this could be a different question.
Okay, very good. And then just generally, maybe to sum everything a bit up, I mean, we have an election upcoming in September, nationally in Germany. And on top, I think we all know the kind of impact of the COVID-19, also in terms of debts and in terms of financial impact, not only the healthcare system, but generally is quite significant. What is your expectation, independent on who might really win the election and which kind of, let's say, government we finally will have? But what is your expectations, what might happen, let's say, after the elections in September for the next 4 years for the healthcare system, and maybe especially around the AMNOG process?
I personally think that the AMNOG process, in its core and around the benefit assessment, will only undergo incremental step-by-step changes and not really changes because of a financial pressure. I think we can assume that there will be more financial pressure on the statutory health insurance system, and also a new government needs to organize money, maybe also out of the drug sector. But I think we should distinguish between development of the benefit assessment process and savings, because with the new or changed benefit assessment process, you will never get quick wins in terms of relevant savings very soon. So if we need money, then it's quite simple. Then we start the tendering for biosimilars earlier, or we think, we have a long history of temporary additional mandatory discounts for all drugs in the market. These are the ways I would anticipate if quick wins in terms of savings are needed. And everything about the AMNOG process, I think, is more step-by-step and more really based on the quality of the process. That would be my expectation, not really a mixture, a way of changing the AMNOG process to get short-term savings or quick savings, because I think this is not really sensible, and that if you really need quick money, that doesn't help.
Okay, perfect. Very good. So I think that was it. Thank you very much for your time, Mathias. I think that was very good insights, also with good examples. And I think you can now also feel a bit how the AMNOG process is really being applied. And I think why it is, I think, also be seen also from outside of Germany, quite a success story. So great insights from Mathias Flume on the AMNOG process and the learnings, what we can probably all take from the last 10 years of AMNOG. Let's just also see what the future will bring. There is a new election in autumn 2021. And once we basically broadcast that episode of the podcast, also that election will be gone. So we might even have already some further insights into what changes maybe might happen into the AMNOG process. Overall, I think also what Mathias said, I think it's not only a learning system, what the AMNOG basically presents, but it has really also, I think, adapted over time into the different kind of situations, whether that was maybe from an endpoint perspective, where I think both parties, I would say, the pharmaceutical industry, but also the GBA has basically, let's say, adapted, I would not say learned, but adapted to the realities of sometimes also different disease areas. I think the orphan drug area is obviously an important one. I think incentives are clearly given by the EMA, for example, but also, and that was one of the intentions by the Ministry of Health and also by the GBA, to also have those incentives from a reimbursement perspective in Germany. Let's just see if this might basically change over time. I think innovation can make it not only to the national, but quite clearly to the regional and local market, meaning to the patients, at least so far. So let's just see how this will evolve over time. Listen further into one of our next AMNOG podcasts, also following in the next couple of months. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast, provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.